Far beyond the edge of human maps, in a region of space marked only by dead stars and old wars, the Zhaltari Dominion ruled over 4,000 worlds. It had done so for a very long time. Nobody in the Dominion could say exactly how long, because the empire was so old that its own historians argued about which calendar to trust. What everyone agreed on was this: the Dominion had never lost a war it chose to fight, not once, not in a million years. The reason for that unbroken record sat in the center of a quiet, cold room on the capital world of Zal Prime. It was called the Oracle Engine, and it was not a person, though everyone spoke to it as if it were one. It was a machine built from the wreckage of 1,000 old wars, fed with the data of every battle the Dominion had ever fought, and every battle it had ever watched other empires fight. When two fleets moved toward each other, the Oracle Engine could tell you who would win before a single shot was fired. It was right almost every time. Not most of the time. Almost every time. So when the signal came in from a small, unremarkable star system on the far edge of Dominion space, nobody was worried. A listening post near the edge of known space had picked up a strange radio signal, weak and old, leaking out from a system with only one habitable world. The system was called Sol. The world was called Earth. The signal itself was almost an accident. It was a mix of old broadcasts, television and radio waves, drifting outward for over 100 years. The kind of leakage every young civilization produced without meaning to. A Dominion science ship, the Annette Vel, happened to be passing close enough to catch it. The crew logged it, ran it through their translators, and sent a full report back to the capital. It was meant to be nothing more than paperwork. Instead, it landed on the desk of Grand Admiral Vorn Kalith. Vorn Kalith had commanded Dominion fleets for over 300 years. He had crushed rebellions, absorbed smaller empires, and negotiated the surrender of proud old civilizations that had once called themselves great. He read the report on Earth with the same mild interest he gave to most first contact files. A young species, still tied to one planet, still burning chemical fuel to leave their own atmosphere. Their fastest ships crawled through space at a speed the Dominion considered a joke. Their weapons were built to kill each other in small numbers, not to fight in the vacuum of space. By every measure the Dominion used, humanity was not a threat. It was barely even a curiosity. Still, protocol was protocol. Before any new species could be added to the Empire, even a weak one, the Dominion's War Council required a formal battle forecast. It was mostly a formality, a rubber stamp on conquests that were already decided. Vorn brought the data to the Oracle Engine himself, more out of habit than need. The chamber that housed the Oracle Engine was simple compared to the rest of the palace. No decoration, no grand columns, just smooth dark walls and a single raised platform where a person could stand and speak directly to the machine. Vorn stepped onto the platform and gave the order. "Run the forecast," he said. "Species designation, human, homeworld, Earth, full data attached." The Oracle Engine did not answer right away, which was normal. It was not calculating an answer so much as searching through history for the closest matches, comparing this new species to every other species the Dominion had ever measured. After a few moments, a calm, even voice filled the room. "Analysis complete," the Oracle Engine said. "Human civilization classification, type 0.7, pre-warp, single system presence. Estimated military capability, minimal. Estimated technological gap, significant, in the Dominion's favor. Forecast for direct conflict. Human surrender within 5 hours of confirmed hostile contact. Estimated Dominion losses, 0. Vorn allowed himself a small, tired smile. 5 hours. That was almost generous, by Oracle Engine standards. Some newly discovered species had been given forecasts of surrender within minutes. "Confidence level?" he asked, mostly for the record. 99.6%, the Oracle Engine replied. That was enough. The War Council did not need to gather in full session for something this small. Vorn filed the forecast, marked the Earth system for what the Dominion called peaceful incorporation, and moved on to matters that actually required his attention. Peaceful incorporation was the polite name for what happened next. A small fleet would arrive, demonstrate enough force to make resistance pointless, and the local government would sign the standard surrender terms. It happened dozens of times a year across the Empire's outer edge. Nobody in the Dominion expected Earth to be any different. 3 cruisers were assigned to the mission. That number alone said everything about how seriously the Dominion took this new species. 3 cruisers was the smallest force ever sent to bring a new world into the Empire, usually reserved for planets with no orbital defenses worth mentioning. Vorn considered going himself, mostly out of boredom, but decided against it. He assigned the mission to a capable but unremarkable officer named Commander Ashil Doru, a steady hand who had overseen a dozen similar incorporations without incident. It was, by every measure the Dominion had, the easiest kind of assignment there was. Before the fleet departed, Vorn allowed himself one habit he rarely admitted to anyone. He liked to read whatever scraps of culture came bundled with a new species' first contact file. It made the conquests feel less like paperwork. The file on Earth contained fragments of human broadcasts, translated as best the Dominion systems could manage. There were strange things in there. Songs about love and loss. Stories of small groups of people standing against much larger enemies, and somehow winning. Recordings of speeches given during wars, fought entirely with primitive weapons on a single planet. Wars that had cost millions of lives, over disagreements the Dominion found almost impossible to understand. Vorn found it all mildly interesting, in the way an old man might find a child's drawing interesting. He noted, with something close to sentiment, that humans seemed to tell each other a great many stories about beating impossible odds. It was, he thought, a very human kind of comfort. Every young species did something like it. The Dominion's own ancient histories were full of similar stories, tales told before they understood how the universe actually worked, before they learned that overwhelming force decided outcomes far more often than courage did. He mentioned this, once, to his aide, a younger officer named Pel Isarn, who had only recently joined his staff. "It is strange," Vorn said, turning one of the translated recordings over in his mind, "how every species we meet believes, right up until the moment we arrive, that they are the exception, that their courage, or their cleverness, or their sheer stubbornness, will somehow be enough. None of them ever are." Pel, still new enough to find these first contact files fascinating rather than routine, asked the obvious question. "Has there ever been an exception, Admiral, in all your years of service?" Vorn considered this longer than he expected to. "Once," he admitted, "early in my career. A species called the Threll, 3 systems over from here, held out for almost 2 full days before their forecast finally came true. Their commanders were clever. They understood terrain, understood how to use their own planet's gravity wells against our approach vectors. It cost us 4 ships instead of none." He paused. It still ended exactly the way the Oracle engine said it would. Cleverness bought them 2 days. It did not buy them a different outcome. Pel nodded slowly, filing the story away as the kind of thing an admiral told a junior officer to teach a lesson, without quite saying so directly. Neither of them thought, even for a moment, that Earth might prove any different. 2 days was already considered a remarkable outlier in the Dominion's long history of conquest. 5 hours, for a species this primitive, was practically a courtesy. The War Council received Vorn's report on the Earth forecast 3 days later, in a session dominated by far larger matters. A trade dispute with a neighboring empire, a mining rights disagreement between 2 Dominion colony worlds, a request for additional funding to expand the shipyards near the capital. Earth's incorporation was mentioned for perhaps 30 seconds, buried in a long list of routine business, approved without discussion or objection. Councillor Meth Sarai, the oldest member of the council, barely glanced up from her datapad when the item was read aloud. She had sat through thousands of similar reports across her long life, and had long since stopped expecting any of them to be interesting. If she had looked more closely, she might have noticed the one detail in the file that did not quite fit the Dominion's usual pattern: the age of the underlying survey data. 6 years was not, on its own, an unusual gap between a scouting report and a full incorporation mission. Dominion bureaucracy moved slowly, and 6-year delays were common enough that nobody thought to flag it. But 6 years was also, coincidentally, exactly enough time for a frightened, determined species to change everything about itself, without anyone noticing. Nobody flagged it. Nobody thought to ask whether 6 years might have been enough time for anything at all to change on a planet nobody had bothered to look at again, since the initial data was collected. The forecast said what it said. The number was the number. In an empire built on trusting the Oracle engine's judgment above almost anything else, that was considered enough. What Vorn did not know, and what the Oracle engine could not have known either, was where the Dominion's information on Earth had actually come from. 6 years earlier, a small Dominion scout probe had entered the solar system on a routine long-range survey. the kind sent out in the thousands to quietly map new star systems, long before any fleet arrived. That probe had drifted too close to Earth's atmosphere, suffered a system failure, and crashed in a stretch of desert in the American state of Nevada. The wreck had been recovered within hours by a branch of the United States military that did not exist on any public document. What followed was 6 years of quiet, careful work, shared in secret among a handful of the world's governments. The probe's technology was centuries beyond anything humanity had built, but it was not magic. It was engineering, and engineering could be studied, understood, and eventually copied. Human scientists were slow at first, then faster still, working with a kind of desperate focus that only comes from knowing exactly what is coming. The Dominion's forecast had been built entirely on data from before that crash, old radio leakage, distant telescope images of primitive rockets, decades-old estimates of human technology. The probe that could have told them the truth had gone silent the moment it crashed, and no other Dominion asset had come close enough to update the file since. As far as the Oracle engine knew, humanity was still exactly what it had been 6 years ago. It had no way of knowing that the 6 years had not been quiet at all. On Earth, very few people knew that anything unusual was happening in the sky. The governments involved had kept the secret tightly held, sharing only what was needed with only who needed it. Even so, rumors moved the way rumors always do. A retired engineer in Ohio, half paying attention to the news one evening, noticed an odd story about unscheduled satellite activity over the Pacific and thought little of it before going back to his dinner. A group of teenagers in Seoul, more interested in filming content for their channels than in world events, joked about alien ships after spotting strange lights in the night sky, never once suspecting they were joking about something real. A young naval officer stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, part of a small and highly classified planetary defense unit, ran drills late into the night with a level of seriousness his neighbors would never have guessed, training for a battle none of them were allowed to speak of. None of these people knew each other. None of them understood the full shape of what was coming, but all of them, in their own way, were standing on the edge of something enormous, and all of them would remember, for the rest of their lives, the ordinary evening before everything changed. The retired engineer in Ohio was named Walter Briggs, and he had spent 30 years designing turbine engines before quietly retiring to a small house outside Dayton. He had no idea that the strange news story he'd half noticed was connected to anything real. He also had no idea that decades earlier, in a much younger version of his career, he had briefly consulted on a classified materials project he was never told the purpose of. One small piece of a puzzle he would never learn he had helped complete. That evening, he finished his dinner, watched an old film, and went to bed without the faintest idea that his old, forgotten work was, at that very moment, orbiting silently above his head in the form of a defense satellite, disguised as space debris. The teenagers in Seoul filmed their joke about alien lights for barely 90 seconds, before losing interest and moving on to other content. The video quietly uploaded and mostly ignored by an audience of a few hundred people. None of them suspected that the lights they had filmed, dismissed as a trick of the atmosphere or a distant satellite catching sunlight strangely, were the tracking signatures of a Dominion scout drone making one final, quiet pass through the outer solar system before returning home, with data that would, 6 years later, form the exact forecast the Oracle engine relied upon. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Eyre, in Norfolk, had joined the program in its second year, recruited quietly from a promising career in conventional naval intelligence after a background check flagged her as exactly the kind of steady, careful officer the effort needed. She had told her family she'd been reassigned to a special research liaison role, a lie so boring that nobody in her life had ever thought to question it further. That night, before the alarms came, she sat alone in her small apartment reviewing simulation data for the dozenth time that month, running through scenarios that had, until now, always felt slightly unreal, like preparing for a storm that everyone insisted was coming, but that never quite seemed to arrive. Far above them, drifting silently through the dark toward the solar system, 3 Dominion cruisers carried a 5-hour countdown that the most powerful predictive machine in the galaxy had already declared, with almost total confidence, to be a formality. Nobody aboard those ships had any idea they were flying into the shortest war in the Dominion's long history. 6 years is not a long time for a civilization. It is barely a breath in the life of a species, let alone an empire that measures its history in hundreds of thousands of years. But 6 years, spent by frightened and determined people who know exactly what is coming, can be enough to change everything. It started with a hole in the Nevada desert and a piece of metal the size of a delivery truck. When the crashed probe was found, the officers who arrived on the scene understood almost nothing about it. It had no wheels, no visible engine, no wings. Its hull was made of a material that resisted every drill and cutting torch available at the time. For the first few weeks, most of the work was simply figuring out how to open it without destroying whatever was inside. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely place, a materials scientist named Dr. Elena Voss, who had spent her career studying how metals behaved under extreme heat. She noticed that the probe's hull did not resist cutting tools by being harder. It resisted them by moving, on a level too small to see, shifting its own structure in response to pressure. It was not armor in the way humans understood armor. It was closer to a living reflex, built into non-living material. Once her team understood that, they could work with it instead of against it. Progress was slow, but it began. Word of the discovery reached the highest levels of government within days. What might have become a public panic, instead, became one of the most closely guarded secrets in modern history. A small group of nations, chosen not for size or wealth, but for their existing scientific infrastructure, formed a quiet alliance that outsiders never saw. There was no press conference, no announcement, no United Nations vote. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding among a handful of leaders. If one alien probe had come this close by accident, others would follow, and next time, it might not be an accident at all. The project that grew from the wreck did not have a dramatic name. Officially, it was called the Deep Systems Research Initiative, a title boring enough that nobody outside the project ever thought twice about it. Unofficially, the small number of people who worked on it simply called it the program. The early years were the hardest. Human science, brilliant as it was, had never had to consider some of the basic assumptions built into the probe's design. Its propulsion system did not work the way any human rocket worked. It bent space in small, careful amounts rather than pushing against it. Its computer systems processed information in ways that early attempts to copy nearly burned out entire buildings' worth of equipment. Every answer produced 10 new questions. But humanity had one advantage the Dominion never accounted for. It did not need to invent everything from nothing. It only needed to understand what was already sitting in front of it, piece by piece, system by system. An old proverb, repeated often in the program's research labs, put it simply: it is easier to read a book than to write one. The probe was a book written in a language no human had ever seen, but it was still, in the end, a book. By the second year, propulsion research had produced its first working test model, small and unstable, capable of a brief and dangerous jump that moved a 10-kilogram object several kilometers in less time than light itself could travel the distance. It was not much, but it worked, and once something worked once, it could be made to work again, and better. By the third year, the world's militaries had quietly begun retrofitting existing ships and satellites with early defense systems built from what the program had learned. None of this was announced. None of it needed to be. The nations involved had long since stopped pretending this was only research. They were building, as quietly and quickly as they could, something meant to survive first contact with a species that clearly had technology humanity did not yet possess. The fourth year brought a discovery that changed the entire direction of the program. Buried deep in the probe's systems, protected behind layers of encryption that took nearly a full year to work through, was something the scientists had not expected: fragments of the probe's own mission logs. Most of it was routine survey data, meaningless without more context. But some of it, patched together slowly by a team led by a young data analyst named Marcus Chen, painted a picture of the empire that had sent the probe. It was called the Galactic Dominion. It was old, it was enormous, and it measured new species not by their potential, but by a single number generated by something the logs referred to only as the engine. This was the moment the program's mission changed from curiosity to survival. If an entire empire judged new worlds by feeding them into a machine and reading out a number, then humanity's only real defense was to become a number that machine could not predict. The fifth year was spent almost entirely on deception, alongside continued research. If the Dominion's most recent data on Earth came from before the crash, then the single greatest advantage humanity had was time nobody on the other side knew was passing. Public military budgets were kept deliberately unchanged. Official statements about space programs continued to describe slow, modest, entirely conventional progress. Every new advance made by the program was hidden not behind secrecy alone, but behind the appearance of nothing happening at all. If anyone from the Dominion ever looked at Earth again, from far away, they needed to see exactly what they expected to see. A young, primitive species, still burning chemical fuel, still years away from leaving its own solar system. Behind that quiet public face, the truth was very different. By the 6th year, drone swarms guided by artificial intelligence, needing no life support, and capable of maneuvers that would kill any human pilot, had been tested in secret over remote stretches of ocean and desert. Point defense systems, built from adapted probe technology, ringed key locations on Earth and, eventually, in orbit, disguised in satellite housings that looked, from a distance, like ordinary communication equipment. Ships were under construction in hidden facilities, their true propulsion systems buried behind covers of conventional design, ready to reveal their real capability only if the moment ever came. Through all 6 years, the people working on the program lived strange, divided lives. Dr. Elena Voss still attended her niece's birthday parties and pretended her work was ordinary government research. Marcus Chen still argued with his roommate about whose turn it was to do the dishes, all while carrying, in the back of his mind, the knowledge that an alien empire somewhere out among the stars had already decided humanity's fate and simply hadn't gotten around to acting on it yet. Not everyone knew the full truth. Most people on Earth knew nothing at all. Governments outside the small alliance running the program remained unaware, going about ordinary business, arguing over ordinary problems, never suspecting the scale of what a handful of their counterparts were quietly preparing for. Even within the countries involved, only a small circle of officials, scientists, and military officers understood the full picture. The rest of the world simply lived its life, unaware that it was being protected by people who could never explain why. There were moments, across those 6 years, when the secret nearly broke. In the 2nd year, a journalist investigating unusual land purchases near a remote stretch of the Nevada desert came uncomfortably close to the truth, publishing a story about mysterious military activity that generated a brief flurry of public curiosity before quietly fading away, dismissed by most readers as another conspiracy theory, in a world already full of them. The program's leadership, watching the story spread and then die out on its own, allowed themselves a rare moment of dark humor. The safest secrets, it turned out, were often the ones so strange that ordinary people simply refused to believe them, even when the evidence was placed directly in front of them. In the 4th year, a low-level technician working on early drone guidance systems grew suspicious enough of the project's true purpose to attempt contact with an old journalist friend, hoping to raise an alarm about what he believed might be a dangerous, unaccountable military program. He was quietly reassigned before the call was ever placed, offered a generous transfer to an unrelated research post overseas, and given just enough true information about the stakes involved to convince him that silence, however uncomfortable, served humanity's best interests. He accepted, if reluctantly, and never spoke of his suspicions again. Not every secret survives on discipline alone. Sometimes it survives on the quiet, difficult choices of people who understand, even without full context, when a larger truth is more important than their own doubts. The program's leadership itself was never a single, unified body, making smooth decisions with total confidence. Behind the calm procedures and steady progress reports lay years of genuine argument. Some officials pushed for public disclosure almost from the beginning, believing humanity had a right to know what was coming, and a duty to prepare together rather than in secret. Others argued, just as forcefully, that panic would waste the very time the program needed most, that a world thrown into chaos by the truth would be far less capable of building real defenses than a world kept calm by ignorance. Neither side ever fully won the argument. The compromise that emerged, uneasy and imperfect, was secrecy, paired with speed. Keep the world in the dark, but move as fast as humanly possible, to make sure that darkness never became a fatal weakness. Dr. Elena Voss, further along in her strange double life by the 5th year, had become one of the program's most senior scientists, though almost nobody outside a handful of secure facilities knew her name. She had long since stopped attending her niece's birthday parties, the demands of the work leaving less and less room for the ordinary rhythms of family life. And she carried a quiet, private grief about that loss, even as she poured herself into research that might, one day, save every family on the planet. including the one she rarely saw anymore. It was a trade she had made without ever being asked whether she wanted to make it. The way most people swept into the program's orbit eventually found themselves making trades they never expected. On the night the alarms finally came, that 6-year silence broke all at once. It began with a single detection, an anomaly in deep space sensor data that the program's monitoring systems had been trained specifically to look for. An energy signature, matching patterns from the crashed probe's own logs, but far larger, far stronger, unmistakably artificial. Within minutes, that single detection multiplied into 3 distinct signatures, moving toward the solar system at a speed no human ship could match. Alerts moved instantly through the program's private channels, bypassing ordinary chains of command, waking officials in the middle of the night across a dozen time zones. There was no panic, not really, not the kind of panic people might imagine. 6 years of quiet preparation had turned fear into procedure. Every person in the program had rehearsed, in one way or another, for exactly this moment. In Norfolk, a young naval officer named Lieutenant Commander Sarah Iyer received the alert on a secure line at 2 in the morning and was in her operations center within 20 minutes, activating systems she had trained on for years, but never once expected to use for real. In Ohio, the retired engineer who had once shrugged off a strange news story would never learn how close he had come to noticing the truth months earlier. In Seoul, the group of teenagers who had joked about alien lights in the sky were about to get proof they never wanted, though they wouldn't understand what they were truly seeing until it was already happening above their heads. Far above Earth, the automated defense grid, hidden for years behind the appearance of ordinary satellites and debris, quietly shifted into a state very few systems on the planet were designed to reach. It waited, patient and silent, exactly as it had been built to. In Seoul, the group of teenagers who had once joked about strange lights in the sky had, in the years since, mostly forgotten about that 90-second video, moving on to new interests, new friend groups, new small dramas of ordinary teenage life. None of them worked for any government, held any security clearance, or had the faintest idea that a program like the one hidden in Nevada even existed. They were, in every way that mattered to the story about to unfold, simply ordinary people who happened to be standing in the right place at the right time with a phone camera ready, the same way ordinary people so often end up as accidental witnesses to history. As the 6th year drew to a close, the tone inside the program shifted from quiet dread to something closer to grim readiness. Simulations run against the best available models of Dominion tactics, built painstakingly from fragments recovered in the crashed probe's mission logs, suggested that humanity's hidden defenses stood a real chance, not merely of survival, but of a genuine and rapid victory, provided the element of surprise held. Every test, every drill, every quiet late-night argument among the program's leadership came back to the same fragile hope. If the Dominion still believed what its old data told it, if nobody arrived early enough to notice the truth, humanity's best chance was not a long, grinding war of attrition. It was a single, overwhelming demonstration of strength, delivered so fast and so completely that the Dominion would have no time to adjust before the fighting was already over. Nobody could be certain the theory would hold until it was tested against a real enemy. That test arrived without warning, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable night, when 3 unfamiliar energy signatures lit up monitoring stations across the globe within seconds of each other. 3 Dominion cruisers, carrying a 5-hour countdown and a battle forecast built on outdated information, crossed the edge of the solar system and began their final approach toward Earth. They had no idea what they were flying into. The 3 Dominion cruisers dropped out of their final jump at the edge of Earth's orbit, close enough that their sensors immediately began painting a full picture of the planet below. Commander Ashil Doru stood on the bridge of the lead ship, the vessel of measured judgment, and watched the blue and white world grow steady on the main display. It looked, to her eyes, almost exactly like every other pre-warp world she had helped bring into the Dominion. Oceans, clouds, scattered lights on the night side marking cities that had no idea what was coming. "Sensor sweep complete," reported her tactical officer, a calm veteran named Trell Kessa. "Confirmed. Single inhabited world. Orbital presence minimal. No detected weapons platforms of significant scale. Matches pre-mission data closely." Ashil nodded. This was as routine as it got. "Prepare the standard contact broadcast. Full translation package. All major human languages. Let's not waste time." The broadcast went out on every frequency the Dominion systems could identify as being in active use, across the planet below. It was, by Dominion tradition, a simple message. Identification of the Dominion, notice of Earth's classification as a pre-warp civilization eligible for incorporation, and a formal ultimatum. Surrender terms were attached, along with a countdown. 5 hours. After that, the message stated plainly, the Dominion fleet would take whatever action was necessary to secure compliance. What happened next surprised the entire bridge crew more than anything in recent memory. The response came back in under 90 seconds. Ashel had expected days of confusion, false starts, garbled attempts at communication, the kind of chaotic first contact typical of young species, suddenly forced to grasp an impossible truth. Instead, a clear, calm reply arrived on the same frequency, in perfect translation, from a source identifying itself only as a Joint Planetary Coordination Office. The reply acknowledged receipt of the Dominion's message. It stated that humanity understood the terms presented. It requested clarification on several specific points of the surrender agreement, phrased with the kind of precise, careful language usually seen in seasoned diplomats, not a species making first contact with an alien empire for the first time. On the bridge, Trell Kessa frowned at his console. That response time isn't natural for a species this young. Their translation matrices shouldn't even exist yet. Perhaps they've been expecting visitors, Ashel said, though something about the smoothness of the reply nagged at her more than she wanted to admit. She filed the thought away and gave the order for a demonstration. It was standard procedure, one used in dozens of incorporations before. A show of force, precise and controlled, meant to remove any doubt in the local population's mind about the wisdom of resistance. The target selected was an uninhabited research outpost on Earth's moon, a small structure with no personnel, chosen specifically because it would prove the Dominion's power without costing a single human life. Mercy, of a sort. The Dominion preferred compliant new worlds to grieving, angry ones. "Fire the demonstration shot," Ashel ordered. A single precise energy bolt left the vessel of measured judgment, arcing toward the small lunar outpost with a flight time of only a few seconds. On the bridge, officers watched the display, expecting to see a brief flash and a cloud of dust where the structure had been. It was a moment that had played out identically many times before, on many other worlds, always ending the exact same way. This time, it did not. Less than a second before impact, the bolt simply vanished from the tracking display. Not deflected, not absorbed, gone, as though it had never existed. For a moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. "Report," Ashel said, her voice sharper now. Trell Kessa stared at his console, running the data again, as if his instruments had simply made an error. The shot was intercepted. Something took it out less than half a second before impact. "I'm not reading any launch signature from the surface. There was no visible interceptor." "Then what stopped it?" "I don't know," Trell admitted. "There's nothing there. Whatever it was, our sensors never saw it coming, and they still can't find it now." Across the ship, quiet unease began to replace the earlier confidence. Ashel ordered a wider sensor sweep, this time searching not just for weapons platforms but for anything unusual across the entire system. Unexplained energy signatures, hidden structures, anything that might explain what had just happened. The results came back frustratingly plain. Space around Earth looked, on every scan, almost exactly the way the original survey data had described it years earlier. A few satellites, some orbital debris, nothing that should have been capable of stopping a Dominion energy bolt from a range of nearly 400,000 kilometers. Trell Kessa ran the numbers a third time, hoping a different approach might reveal something the first two attempts had missed. He tried adjusting the sensor arrays to focus on gravitational anomalies, then on thermal signatures, then on the kind of subtle energy fluctuations that sometimes betrayed a cloaked object, even when direct scans failed. Nothing worked. Whatever had stopped the bolt had done so with a level of precision that left no fingerprint behind it all, which was, in its own strange way, more frightening than if it had left an obvious one. A weapon that could be measured could be understood. A weapon that vanished without a trace suggested something operating on principles the Dominion's own scientists had never needed to develop. Could it be a natural phenomenon? Ashel asked, though she already suspected the answer. At that precision, aimed at exactly the right moment, hitting a target moving at exactly that speed, Trell shook his head slowly. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient, Commander. Something intercepted that shot on purpose. I just can't tell you what, or how, or from where. What none of the Dominion's instruments could detect was the truth. The orbital debris scattered quietly around Earth was not debris at all. It was a distributed point defense network, built over years, disguised deliberately to look like exactly the kind of harmless clutter every developed world accumulated in orbit. Each piece was small, unremarkable, and individually unimpressive. Together, they formed a system capable of detecting and destroying incoming projectiles with a speed and precision that had nothing to do with brute strength and everything to do with careful, patient engineering. Aboard the ship, Commander Ashel Doru made the first serious mistake of her long career. She assumed what had happened was an anomaly, a fluke, a sensor error masking a natural event like an unusually placed asteroid or a strange gravitational quirk. Everything in her experience told her a species this primitive could not possibly possess technology capable of what she had just witnessed. She reported the incident up the chain as unexplained interference, recommended caution, but did not recommend retreat. The forecast, after all, still stood. 99.6% confidence. A single strange event did not overturn a number like that. Down on Earth, the response to the Dominion's demonstration shot moved through very different channels. The moment the incoming bolt had been detected, alerts fired across every monitoring station in the program's network. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Iyer, standing in the operations center in Norfolk, watched the automated defense grid respond exactly as it had been designed to, intercepting the threat in a fraction of a second, long before any human hand could have reacted in time even if one had tried. Confirmed intercept, her systems officer reported, voice tight with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Grid responded within design parameters. No debris reached the lunar surface. Sarah allowed herself one slow breath before turning to the next task. 6 years of preparation had led to this exact moment, and it had worked exactly as promised. That mattered more than she could put into words right then, but there was no time to dwell on it. Get me confirmation from the other stations. If they tested us once, they'll test us again, and next time it might not be aimed somewhere empty. Across the ocean, in a quiet command center outside Seoul, another team watched the same event unfold on their own instruments, and for the first time in 6 years, allowed themselves the smallest flicker of hope. In Norfolk, Sarah Iyer allowed herself only a few seconds of relief before the weight of what was actually happening settled fully over her. This was not a drill. Every simulation her team had run over the past 6 years had been, in the end, only a guess about how a real Dominion ship might behave, built from fragments of old mission logs and careful extrapolation. Now, for the first time, she was watching an actual, living enemy respond in real time, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that every decision from this point forward would be made without a script to follow. "They're not retreating," her systems officer said, watching the 3 Dominion cruisers hold their position on the display. "If anything, they look like they're deciding what to do next." "Then we give them time to decide," Sarah said. "We don't fire again unless they do. Let's not turn a demonstration into a war if we don't have to." She meant it too, though she understood better than almost anyone in the room how thin that hope really was. 6 years of preparation had been built around the assumption that the Dominion, once shown clear proof of Earth's strength, might choose caution over conquest. It was not a certainty. It was, at best, an educated gamble, one the entire planet's safety now rested on. She thought, briefly, of every argument she had heard inside the program over the years, about whether secrecy had been the right choice, whether the world deserved to know what was coming long before this moment arrived. There was no time to relitigate any of that now. There was only the next few minutes, and whatever the 3 ships above them chose to do with them. Above them all, the 3 Dominion cruisers held their position, uncertain for the first time in longer than any of the crew could remember. On the bridge of the vessel of measured judgment, a tense quiet had settled over the crew, the kind that comes after an experienced team encounters something none of their training prepared them for. Officers who had served together through a dozen incorporations exchanged glances they rarely needed to exchange, the silent language of people realizing, together, that the situation had slipped outside their usual understanding of how these missions unfolded. Ashel Doru gave the order to send a second message, this one less a demonstration and more a direct question. phrased with unusual care for a species the Dominion still officially considered primitive. The reply, when it came, was calm, clear, and utterly unhelpful to the Dominion's growing confusion. It simply restated humanity's earlier position. They understood the terms presented. They had no interest in unnecessary conflict, but they would not be surrendering their world. It offered, almost politely, to discuss mutual terms instead. On the bridge of the vessel of measured judgment, Trelkessa broke the stunned silence that followed. "They're not afraid," he said quietly. "They should be terrified. They're not." Ashil stared at the blue planet on the main display. The forecast's 99.6% confidence, sitting in the back of her mind, like a stone she could no longer quite trust. For the first time since she had taken command, she felt something she had not felt in 300 years of service. She felt doubt. She considered, briefly, requesting permission to withdraw and reassess before proceeding further. It would have been the cautious choice, and in 300 years of service, she had learned that caution rarely cost more than a little wounded pride. But the Oracle Engine's forecast still sat in her orders, unchanged and unchallenged, backed by a machine that had never once been wrong, across 4,000 recorded conflicts. Overruling that kind of certainty on nothing more than an uneasy feeling would have required a confidence she did not quite have, not yet, not without more evidence than a single missed shot and an oddly calm voice on the radio. So instead of retreating, she did what generations of Dominion officers before her had been trained to do, when the numbers said victory was assured and the evidence in front of them suggested otherwise. She trusted the numbers, and she pressed forward. It would prove to be the last mistake of its kind she would ever make. And somewhere far below, hidden in orbit, disguised as harmless debris, humanity's true defenses waited quietly for whatever the Dominion decided to do next. Grand Admiral Vorn Kallith received Commander Ashil report on unexplained interference, with mild irritation rather than alarm. He had commanded fleets long enough to know that first contact missions occasionally produce strange sensor readings, usually explained by local conditions nobody had bothered to survey properly. He sent back a short reply. "Proceed as planned. Use greater force if the local population failed to understand the demonstration, and do not let a single odd reading disrupt an otherwise simple mission." Ashil received the order with the same discomfort she had felt since the demonstration shot vanished from her tracking display. Something about this world did not sit right with her, though she could not point to any single fact that justified her unease. Still, an order was an order, and the Oracle Engine's forecast had not changed. She gave the command for a second, larger demonstration, this time targeting a small, unmanned satellite in Earth orbit, a target chosen specifically because it belonged, according to Dominion records, to no nation's active military. What the Dominion's records did not show was that the satellite in question had been quietly reassigned 2 years earlier, folded into the program's hidden defense network under a civilian designation that had never changed on paper. It was no longer harmless. It had not been harmless for a long time. The moment the second energy bolt left the Dominion cruiser, alarms fired across Earth's monitoring network. This time, the response was not a single quiet interception. This time, the automated grid treated the shot as confirmation of hostile intent, and the true scale of humanity's preparation finally began to show itself. From hidden orbital platforms disguised for years as ordinary satellites, a wave of drone fighters launched in near-total silence. These were not crewed ships, and they never had been. 6 years earlier, the program's engineers had realized something the Dominion's ancient traditions of warfare had never needed to consider. A machine did not need to survive the maneuvers it performed. It only needed to complete its task. Freed from the limits of a living pilot's body, the drones moved in patterns that looked, on Dominion sensors, almost impossible, snapping between vectors, with no gradual buildup, no hesitation, no concern for forces that would have crushed a human body in an instant. Aboard the vessel of measured judgment, Trelkessa's console lit up with dozens of new contacts appearing seemingly out of nothing. Multiple small craft, unknown origin, converging on our position. Speed and maneuvering profile don't match anything in the database. Ashil felt the first true jolt of alarm since taking command of this mission. For a fraction of a second, she thought back to her earlier hesitation, the doubt she had swallowed rather than acted on. There was no time now to second-guess that decision. There was only the battle in front of her. Shields to full. Target the nearest group and fire. The cruiser's weapons answered instantly, sweeping a wide pattern of energy fire toward the incoming drone swarm, the kind of coordinated barrage that had ended dozens of primitive resistance movements before they ever truly began. It should have worked. On any other newly discovered world, it would have worked. The drones scattered instead, breaking formation in patterns too fast and too precise to track, weaving through the barrage with a coordination that looked less like individual pilots reacting, and more like a single mind directing hundreds of bodies at once. Because that was exactly what it was. Every drone in the swarm shared targeting data instantly, adjusting as a single unified system, rather than as separate fighters making separate decisions. The Dominion's weapons, built and refined over centuries to counter fleets of individually piloted ships, found almost nothing to properly target. "They're not taking damage," Trell reported, disbelief clear in his voice, even through his professional training. "Barely any hits registering. They're too fast, and they're not moving like anything organic." He was right, though he did not yet understand exactly why. The program's engineers had spent the better part of 2 years solving a single, stubborn problem. Every existing model of space combat, human or alien, assumed a pilot somewhere in the loop, a living mind that needed time to process information, react, and adjust. Remove that pilot entirely, and replace their judgment with a shared computing network capable of updating every ship's position hundreds of times each second, and the entire shape of what was tactically possible changed. The drones did not dodge because a person aboard them decided to dodge. They moved because the collective system directing them had already calculated, well before the Dominion's shot was ever fired, the small number of paths that would keep every drone in the swarm alive. It looked, from the outside, almost supernatural. It was, in truth, simply math, applied at a speed no biological mind could match. On the bridge of the second cruiser, the silent accord. Captain Rethilvanu watched the same chaos unfold on his own displays and made a decision that, under any other circumstances, would have been sound tactics. He ordered his ship to break formation and flank the incoming swarm from a wider angle, hoping to catch the drones between two lines of fire. It was exactly the kind of maneuver a Dominion officer trained on centuries of ship-to-ship combat would make. It was also exactly the kind of maneuver the drone swarm's coordinating system had been specifically designed to counter. The moment the silent accord moved to flank, a portion of the swarm peeled away and struck its exposed side directly, hitting precise points along the hull that Dominion engineers, working from data recovered from their own crashed probe 6 years earlier, had never suspected humans could identify from the outside. Silent accord. Shields flared bright, held for a few seconds, and then failed entirely along its port side. Secondary explosions rippled down the hull as internal systems overloaded. Within under 2 minutes of the drone swarm's arrival, the silent accord was drifting, powerless, its crew scrambling to contain the damage rather than continue fighting. Captain Rethilvanu, thrown from his command chair by the force of the first major impact, pulled himself back up in time to see damage reports flooding in, faster than his crew could read them aloud. Power core stable, but barely. Weapons offline. Life support holding. For now, though several sections had already been sealed off to contain hull breaches. He gave the only order that still made sense. Full stop. All remaining power to structural integrity and life support. Weapons and countermeasures abandoned entirely, in favor of simply keeping his crew alive. It was not a decision he made easily, but it was the only one that gave his people any real chance of surviving what had, in the space of minutes, become an entirely different kind of battle than the one he had trained for his whole career. Back on the Dominion capital, far too distant to offer any real-time help, the Oracle engine received a live feed of the unfolding battle and attempted, for the first time in its long operational history, to recalculate an active forecast in real time. The attempt failed, not through any malfunction, but because the machine's entire method of prediction depended on comparing new conflicts to patterns from old ones. Every pattern in its memory assumed warfare unfolded in familiar shapes: formal declarations, probing attacks, gradual escalation, individual pilots making individual decisions under individual fear. Humanity's opening move matched none of those patterns. It had gone from a diplomatic exchange to overwhelming, coordinated, inhuman precision force in under 3 minutes, with no pause in between. The Oracle engine, for the first time anyone could remember, returned no updated forecast at all. Its systems flagged the situation as insufficient historical comparison and requested additional processing time. On Jal Prime, the technicians monitoring the machine stared at that message for a long moment before anyone thought to alert the War Council. One senior technician, a woman named Isel Ovaru, who had maintained the Oracle engine for nearly 40 years, read the flagged message 3 times before she fully believed what she was seeing. In 4 decades of service, she had never once seen the machine return an incomplete result during an active conflict. Even in the strangest, most one-sided battles the Dominion had ever fought, the Oracle engine had always produced some kind of number, however uncertain. A blank result was not simply unusual. It was, in the machine's own quiet way, an admission that something about this particular war had broken its most basic assumptions about how war itself worked. Above Earth, the battle had already moved past the point where any forecast could have mattered. Ashel Doru, watching her sister ship go dark on her display, made the hardest decision of her long career. She ordered the vessel of measured judgment and the remaining cruiser, the Iron Resolve, to consolidate their fire and retreat to a defensive position, buying time to understand what they were truly facing. It was, by every standard she had ever been trained under, the correct call. It came too late. What Earth's forces revealed next had been the program's most closely guarded secret of all, the true nature of humanity's propulsion technology. For 6 years, every ship and drone launched publicly had used a deliberately limited, deliberately unimpressive engine design, chosen specifically to match what the Dominion's outdated survey data expected to see. The real technology, adapted painstakingly from the crashed probe's own systems and improved upon by human engineers who refused to accept its limits as final, had been kept entirely hidden, tested only in secret, never once shown to any system capable of reporting back to the Dominion. As Ashel gave the order to retreat, a new wave of ships appeared on her sensors, not from the drone swarm, but from Earth's surface directly, rising through the atmosphere and reaching orbital speeds in a fraction of the time her own cruisers required. These were larger, crude vessels, built quietly over the past 2 years in hidden facilities across 3 continents. Their true engines finally revealed now that concealment no longer served any purpose. "That's not possible," Trell Kessa said quietly, staring at the acceleration figures on his console. "Nothing this young should be able to build ships that move like that." It was not, strictly speaking, impossible. It was simply something the Dominion's outdated data had never accounted for, because the Dominion had never imagined a species using 6 years of secret, focused effort to close a technological gap that, by every historical pattern in the Oracle engine's memory, should have taken centuries. The new human ships did not fire first. They simply moved to surround the 2 remaining Dominion cruisers, cutting off any retreat vector with a precision that left Ashel with no clean path of escape. A final message arrived on the same frequency as before, calm and unhurried, the same careful, measured tone that had unsettled her from the very first exchange. It requested, politely, that the Dominion cruisers stand down and cease fire, noting that further resistance would only increase unnecessary damage on both sides. Ashel Doru looked at her tactical display, at the drifting wreck of the Silent Accord, at the drone swarm still holding position with terrifying patience, at the new ships closing every possible line of retreat, and understood, in a single cold moment of clarity, that everything the Dominion had believed about this world had been wrong from the very beginning. Trell Kessa looked at her, waiting for orders, and for a long moment Ashel said nothing at all. 300 years of service had prepared her for many things. Difficult negotiations, unexpected resistance, even the occasional loss of a single ship in a conflict that ultimately still ended in victory. Nothing in those 3 centuries had prepared her for the particular experience of realizing, in real time, that the single most trusted tool her entire civilization relied upon had simply been wrong, and that the cost of that error was now sitting directly in front of her, in the form of a crippled ship and a fleet of enemy vessels she had no way to outrun. "Cease fire," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "All batteries, stand down. We're not winning this exchange." The order went out across the ship in seconds, weapons powering down one by one, the tension on the bridge shifting from the sharp adrenaline of combat into something heavier and more uncertain. Nobody spoke, nobody needed to. Every person on that bridge understood, without being told, that the battle they had just lived through would be studied and argued over for generations, assuming any of them lived long enough to tell the story themselves. The battle had lasted just under 5 minutes. Silence filled the bridge of the vessel of measured judgment. In the seconds after Commander Ashil Doru gave the order to power down weapons, it was not the silence of defeat exactly, though it was close to that. It was the silence of people trying to understand something that did not fit into any shape they had been trained to recognize. Around her ship and the crippled, silent accord. The human vessels held their positions without advancing further, without firing another shot, without any of the aggressive posturing Ashel had expected from a species that had just won so completely and so quickly. If anything, the calm discipline of their formation unsettled her more than a chaotic celebration would have. A new transmission arrived, this one different from the earlier automated exchanges. It carried the voice of an actual person this time, a woman speaking in careful, measured tones through a translation system smooth enough that Ashel almost forgot she was hearing a machine's interpretation rather than a native tongue. Dominion vessels, this is Fleet Coordinator Sarah Iyer, speaking on behalf of Earth's Joint Planetary Coordination Office. Your ships are currently within range of our defense network. We are not currently firing on you, and we have no wish to continue this engagement. We would like to open direct communication with your commanding officer. Ashil Doru straightened in her chair, forcing calm into a voice that did not entirely feel calm anymore. This is Commander Ashil Doru, acting representative of the Zhaltari Dominion. I hear your request. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Your world has demonstrated capabilities significantly beyond what our data indicated. I would ask you the same in return. What do you want from this exchange? There was a brief pause before the reply came. We want the same thing you claimed to have offered us 5 hours ago. Peaceful terms. We don't want a war with your empire. We simply weren't willing to lose one, if it came to that. Your crew aboard the silent accord are alive. We are prepared to allow safe passage for both of your ships, along with your crew, back to your own territory. And we would welcome the chance to establish proper contact between our peoples going forward. Ashil sat with that for a long moment. It was not the response of a desperate, frightened species clinging to survival. It was the response of a government that had known exactly what it was doing since the very first message arrived, and had simply chosen not to escalate further than necessary. She thought of the Oracle Engine's confident forecast, the 99.6% certainty that this exact situation could never happen, and felt something close to embarrassment on behalf of an empire that had trusted a machine's math over the plain evidence sitting in front of her. She thought, too, of the quiet unease she had felt hours earlier, back before the very first demonstration shot had vanished from her tracking display without explanation. Something in her had known then, in the instinctive way that centuries of experience sometimes teach a person to trust, that the numbers in her orders did not match the world in front of her. She had chosen the numbers anyway, because the numbers had never failed her before, and that choice had cost her a ship and very nearly the lives of an entire crew. She doubted she would make the same choice again, assuming she survived long enough to face a similar decision. I understand, she said at last, though the words felt small against everything she was only beginning to grasp. My orders were built on data that was clearly incomplete. I do not offer that as an excuse, only as an explanation. It's a fair one, Sarah Iyer replied, after a pause of her own. For what it's worth, most people on this planet still don't know any of this happened tonight. When they find out, and they will, it will matter to them whether your empire chose peace once it had the chance, or whether it simply lost and looked for the fastest way home. I will make sure that distinction is recorded accurately, Ashil said. It was, she realized as she said it, the first promise she had made to another species in longer than she could remember, that she genuinely intended to keep, whatever her superiors back home eventually decided to do with the information. I will need to report to my command before agreeing to any terms, she said finally. But I accept your offer of safe passage for now. Thank you for the mercy shown to my crew. The word mercy hung strangely in the air between them, an old-fashioned word from an old-fashioned kind of war, the sort the Dominion told itself it had moved beyond centuries ago. Coordinator Iyer's reply carried the faintest note of something that might have been sympathy. We understand this wasn't the outcome you expected. For what it's worth, it wasn't really the outcome we hoped for either. We would have preferred this never came to a fight at all. Far across the galaxy, on Jal Prime, the War Council gathered in an emergency session that had never once been required in the memory of anyone currently serving. Grand Admiral Vorn Kallith stood before them, reviewing the same battle data the Oracle engine had failed to properly forecast, watching, for the first time in 300 years, a version of events he genuinely could not explain. "Walk me through this again," said Councillor Meth-Sarai, the oldest member present, her voice sharp with disbelief rather than anger. "A Type 0.7 civilization disabled one of our cruisers and forced the surrender of 2 more, in under 5 minutes, using technology that should not exist for centuries, by our own historical models." "That is correct," Vorn said simply. There was no comfortable way to soften the truth. "And the Oracle engine's forecast? 99.6% confidence in human surrender within 5 hours. The forecast was built on survey data collected 6 years prior to first contact, following the loss of a scout probe in that system." Vorn allowed himself a rare admission of uncertainty. "We do not yet know precisely what occurred during those 6 years, but it is clear the humans used that time with extraordinary focus. Whatever technology they reverse-engineered, they advanced it far beyond what any of our models would consider plausible for a species at their stage." A long, uneasy silence spread across the chamber. Every person present understood the deeper implication, even before anyone said it aloud. Councillor Meth-Sarai finally spoke, the thought hanging over all of them. "If a species barely off its own homeworld can do this," she said quietly, "using 6 years of secrecy and desperation, what happens when they are no longer confined to a single system? What happens if they reach true interstellar capability?" Nobody in the chamber had a comfortable answer. Vorn Kallith, standing before a council he had served for centuries, found himself thinking not of strategy or fleet numbers, but of the translated fragments of human culture he had read before the mission departed. The songs about love and loss, the stories of small groups standing against larger enemies and somehow winning. At the time, he had thought of them as a young species' comfort, a way of coping with a universe far larger and colder than they understood. Now he was no longer certain the stories had been comfort at all. Perhaps they had simply been true, told by a species that had learned, long before meeting the Dominion, exactly what it took to survive against impossible odds. "What do you recommend, Admiral?" Councillor Meth-Sarai asked, her voice quieter now than it had been at the start of the session. Vorn considered his answer carefully before speaking. "I recommend patience," he said. "We do not yet understand what this species is capable of, or what drove them to become capable of it in so short a time. A hasty second engagement, launched in anger or embarrassment, would risk far more than 3 cruisers. I recommend we open formal diplomatic contact, learn what we can, and reconsider any future action, only once we have real information to act on, rather than a forecast built on data 6 years out of date." It was not the answer any Grand Admiral in Dominion history had ever been forced to give before, and every person in that chamber understood it. For the first time in longer than anyone present could remember, the Empire's next move toward a newly discovered world would not be decided by the confident certainty of a machine, but by the far more uncertain, far more human process of careful thought, or, as some in the room quietly resented, simple caution born of fear. The Oracle engine itself, still processing the battle's data long after the event had ended, eventually produced a final report, delivered in the same calm voice it always used, though the content of that report unsettled everyone who read it, far more than any forecast in the machine's long history. It stated plainly that its predictive models had failed due to insufficient and outdated data, that humanity's actual technological and strategic profile bore almost no resemblance to the profile it had been given, and that its confidence rating for any future forecasts involving Earth should be considered, for the foreseeable future, unreliable. It was the first time the Oracle engine had ever formally admitted the possibility of its own failure. The technicians responsible for its operation took the machine offline for a full recalibration, a process that had never before been required in the entirety of its service to the Dominion. Back above Earth, the 2 surviving Dominion cruisers were escorted quietly to the edge of the solar system by a small, disciplined group of human ships. Their crews watched closely but treated without cruelty. Aboard the Silent Accord, Captain Reth Ilvanu received word of the surrender with a complicated mixture of relief and shame. Grateful his crew would live, uncertain how he would explain the loss of his ship to a command structure that had never once needed to hear an explanation like this before. The human ships escorting them offered no insults, no displays of triumph, simply a steady, quiet presence that felt, to his surprise, almost respectful. Commander Ashel Doru stood at the viewport of her bridge as her ship prepared for the jump back toward Dominion space, watching the blue and white planet shrink behind her, trying to reconcile the peaceful, patient world she had just witnessed with the devastating efficiency it had shown in battle only hours earlier. She found herself, against every instinct her long career had trained into her, hoping that whatever came next between their two peoples might be shaped more by curiosity than by conquest. It was not a hope she would have admitted aloud to anyone back home, not yet, but it stayed with her all the way through the jump, and long after. She did not know, as her ship finally made its jump and Earth vanished from view, that the very night of the battle, footage of the encounter, captured, without any official permission, by a group of teenagers in Seoul who had once joked about strange lights in the sky, was already spreading across every corner of human media faster than any government could control. What had been the most closely guarded secret in modern history became, within hours, the most widely discussed event in it. People who had gone to sleep unaware that an alien empire even existed woke up to find their entire understanding of the universe rewritten in a single night. The teenagers themselves, stunned by the sudden and overwhelming attention, found their video trending at the very top of every platform on the planet, viewed by more people in a single day than had watched almost any event in human history before it. They had wanted, originally, nothing more than a good video for their small channel. What they got instead was a front-row seat to the night humanity quietly stopped being alone in the universe, and the night an ancient empire learned, in the space of 5 minutes, exactly how wrong its oldest and most trusted machine could be. Far above, in the growing dark beyond the edge of the solar system, the last traces of Dominion engine light faded into the stars, carrying home a warning that would echo through the Empire's highest halls for generations to come. Humanity had not simply survived first contact. It had ended the fight before the Dominion's own predictions had finished counting down, and whatever came next, no machine in the galaxy could promise anyone how that story would end.